Robb Stark was scarcely more than a boy when Eddard Stark, his father, received a raven from King's Landing bearing King Robert's own seal. The news was as unexpected as it was momentous. While Robert Baratheon was not a man known for subtlety or intricate arrangements, he did understand that marriages could mend or break alliances. Ned Stark, called to King's Landing as Hand of the King to replace the lamented Jon Arryn, had scarcely grown accustomed to the bustle and intrigue of the capital's endless corridors when the king, after 4 cups of strong Dornish wine, offhandedly remarked that Mace Tyrell was seeking a royal match for his daughter Marjorie. "Stannis or Renly or that boy you've got, Ned, perhaps that's the better path," the king said, voice as booming as ever, but with a tinge of weariness around his eyes. Ned knew that Robert's interest in marriage alliances was hardly the product of any refined sense of diplomacy. Rather, he was avoiding something: the endless parade of Lannister influence. The gold-haired queen, Cersei, and her family spread their webs through every corridor, every steward's chamber, every hall. A fresh alliance, particularly one in which King Robert's own old friend and the powerful Tyrells united, might offer Robert some balance against Tywin Lannister's cunning. So it was that the notion first seeded: the marriage of Robb Stark, heir of Winterfell, to Marjorie Tyrell, the Rose of Highgarden. Ned Stark, though never relishing intrigue, found himself compelled by circumstances to at least see how this might strengthen the realm, and maybe shield his son from the storms he sensed brewing at court. Yet even in these earliest moments of imagining the betrothal, Ned wrestled with doubts. Catelyn would have her own feelings, not least because a union had long been considered, in hush and dream, between Robb and one of her kin in the Riverlands. But such feelings paled against the greater concern. The Tyrells were a southern house, renowned for their ambition. Would Marjorie be a good partner for Robb, a match for the old values of the North? Ned had heard rumors that Marjorie Tyrell was bright and keen, but also cunning in the way only those raised amidst the aristocracy of Highgarden could be. Still, the potential benefits to House Stark and, indeed, to the entire kingdom were plain. When Ned first wrote to Catelyn from King's Landing about the king's notion, he feared her misgivings. But Cat, too, understood that, as war might loom, alliances needed forging. The Lannisters' power was on the rise. The Tyrells, whether friend or foe, could tip the balance, bringing them closer to House Stark, and by extension giving Robb a powerful southern alliance, might shield the North from isolation if conflict erupted. And besides, if Robert Baratheon's goodwill was behind this match, it would give the union a royal blessing that few could dismiss out of hand. Catelyn's raven returned. She trusted Ned's judgment. She would prepare Winterfell for an arrival, or at least an official envoy from Highgarden, to begin finalizing a betrothal. She also confided that Robb himself, at 15 years of age, had grown into a young man with the courtesy and composure of a fine lord. Though their ways might differ, the Tyrells valued manners, and so Robb would likely make a fine first impression. Thus did the wheels begin to turn. Ned, having gleaned the king's vague approval, indeed, King Robert's sometimes sudden enthusiasms could be enough, turned to the matter with characteristic thoroughness. Peter Baelish, that sly master of coin, even approached the hand privately. "So, my Lord Stark, it seems we have a charming new arrangement in the works. I hear rumors that the Rose of Highgarden might soon bloom in the snowy fields of the north. Let us hope it does not wither in the cold." Littlefinger's teasing smirk offered no sense of genuine camaraderie or ill will, just that usual glimmer of mocking knowledge. "I do not put stock in rumors," Ned replied curtly. "And if you hear any that are false, I trust you won't spread them." Littlefinger made a mocking half-bow. "If anyone is to spread them, my lord, it would not be me." Then, with a wry smile, he turned away, cloak shifting behind him in a swirl of silk. Ned sighed. The capital was rife with tongues that wagged. Word would spread quickly enough, no sense in trying to keep the matter hidden. Instead, he would approach Lord Mace Tyrell properly so that the match could be discussed in open. And so it was. Letters were exchanged, reams of parchment detailing proposed terms, dowries, the question of future allegiances. Mace Tyrell, never one to let an opportunity pass, responded swiftly. He was intrigued. One day, as Ned sat in the solar set aside for him in the Red Keep, a page announced the arrival of Ser Loras Tyrell. The Knight of Flowers glided into the room, slender of build and beautiful of face, wearing a doublet embroidered with gold thread shaped into tiny roses. He bowed politely, though not too deeply, in the manner of a High Lord's favored son. "My Lord Stark," he said, voice resonant yet gentle, "my father asked that I speak with you regarding the potential betrothal. We are, of course, honored by the consideration." Ned studied Loras's face. The lad looked young, no older than Robb, or perhaps a year older, and was said to be a paragon of chivalry, skilled at jousting and eager for glory. The mention of his sister clearly spurred him on. Marjorie was said to be intelligent and well-liked. "Your father thinks highly of the proposed match?" Ned asked, though Mace Tyrell's letters had already made his stance plain. "Very much so," Loras said, politely folding his hands behind his back. "Though I dare say my sister is her own woman and she holds strong opinions of what she wants in life." He paused, giving a small, almost conspiratorial smile. "She will, of course, obey our Lord Father's wishes, but the Tyrells are a close family. If your son is prepared to welcome Marjorie as an equal partner, I suspect they will be very happy together." Ned nodded slowly, relieved that at least in these first steps matters remained amicable. "We welcome your family's interest. The North can be harsh, but we know the meaning of hospitality and loyalty. We do not seek to diminish Marjorie. We would welcome her in full." That was enough formality for Ser Loras. That evening, King Robert threw a small feast, an excuse to carouse and sample more wines. In the corner, Ned and Loras Tyrell conversed quietly, discussing the logistics. Would Marjorie travel with a retinue to Winterfell to finalize the betrothal? Or should the betrothal be sealed in King's Landing? On and on. Robert, passing by with a broad grin, clapped Ned on the back so hard the hand had to steady himself. "See, I told you, Ned," Robert roared. "This is the sort of notion that's good for the realm. Let the Tyrells and the Starks stand together, and by the gods, even Tywin Lannister might think twice." Ned gave Robert the mildest of smiles. "Your Grace," he said. "May the Seven bless this union if it comes to pass." Robert's grin widened. "It will come to pass, Ned. I'll see to it. We can't rely on those golden lions for everything." He emptied his wine cup in 2 swallows, slammed it onto a table, and signaled for a serving girl to refill it. Within a week, word arrived that Marjorie Tyrell and a sizable contingent from Highgarden would be journeying north, first to King's Landing for an audience with the king, and then to continue to Winterfell if all was agreed. As Ned busied himself with that arrangement, he received a letter from Catelyn. Robb was growing anxious, not from fear, but from the flutter of young excitement. He'd never even spoken to Marjorie Tyrell, he knew her only by reputation. And now she might be his betrothed. Still, Cat reported, he was determined to make a good impression, to do his duty to his family and uphold the traditions of the North. The day came when the Highgarden retinue arrived at the towering gates of the Red Keep. They entered in a grand procession that was not quite as ostentatious as the Tyrells could be on tournament days, but it was still impressive. Mace Tyrell rode at the head, regal in his embroidered green cloak. Beside him, in a carriage draped with the golden rose, was Marjorie Tyrell. Although it was unseemly for the entire court to gather in the courtyard, the king insisted upon a public welcome. Robert wanted to impress upon the crowds that this was a moment for celebration. So, beneath the hot southern sun, Mace Tyrell dismounted and, with a flourish, opened the carriage door. Marjorie Tyrell emerged. She was garbed in green and gold, her hair in long, loose curls that framed her face. Slender but poised, she had that certain bearing that made onlookers lean in or crane their necks for a better glimpse. As she descended, she smiled warmly, greeting King Robert with a curtsy. Then she turned to the king's hand, Lord Eddard Stark. "My lord," she said, her voice soft yet clear, "it is an honor to be in the capital at your behest." Ned bowed. "Lady Marjorie, the honor is ours." He tried to see what lay beneath that calm exterior. Was she as cunning as some whispered? Or as gracious as others insisted? She was ushered inside, and over the next few days, in the shadow of the Red Keep, final negotiations took place. King Robert conducted himself with a mixture of boisterous optimism and offhand pride, as though the success of this match would reflect well on him. Mace Tyrell, for all his pomp, was clearly pleased. Peter Baelish hovered, gleaning gossip. Varys drifted by from time to time, murmuring compliments about Marjorie's beauty and potential as a future lady of the North. Queen Cersei, of course, wore a perfectly polite smile, but Ned could sense her displeasure. This new alliance threatened the Lannisters' hold on the king. Marjorie, for her part, carried herself with that same calm graciousness. She asked after Winterfell, its climate, its people, its traditions. She showed keen interest in the old gods, wanting to know whether, if she were to wed Robb, she would have the option to keep a small September. Ned assured her that while the North was dedicated to the ancient weirwoods, there would be no hostility to her southern faith. Indeed, Catelyn herself kept the faith of the Seven. Marjorie smiled and responded that she would be honored to learn the ways of her new home, too. At length, everything was settled. the king affixed his royal seal. The lords parted with shallow bows or elaborate flourishes. Margaery prepared to travel northward in the company of a measured retinue that included her father, her grandmother Lady Olenna Redwine, who insisted on coming to ensure her granddaughter's well-being, and a smattering of knights sworn to House Tyrell. Ned returned to Winterfell first. He had pressing matters in the north to attend to, and he wanted to be certain that everything was in order for the forthcoming betrothal. King Robert had grudgingly let him go, though the king half-heartedly grumbled about losing his hand so soon. But Ned sensed the tension in the air. The more time he spent in the capital, the more he felt something in the realm was not right. If the Lannisters tried anything bold, or if unrest broke out, the North needed to be prepared. Meanwhile, King Robert's goodwill traveled with Margaery in the form of letters and gifts, a lavish gesture meant to show that this union had the crown's blessing. Even so, Margaery's party had to cross hundreds of leagues, from the mild climes of the Reach, through the Riverlands, and then beyond the Neck into the north. The journey would take weeks. Catelyn, upon receiving her husband's message that they would soon have guests, set Winterfell into a cheerful bustle. Halls were cleaned, tapestries dusted, and fresh rushes strewn about. Sansa, in her excitement, helped arrange flowers and asked endless questions about Margaery Tyrell. Arya scowled at the fuss, preferring to slip away for lessons in swordplay with Syrio Farrell. Bran, still mobile at this point, though he had recently begun climbing with unusual daring, asked if Margaery might arrive with knights who would tell him stories. Rickon, too young to understand, just babbled about wanting sweets at the feast. Robb Stark bore himself with outward calm, but the curiosity in his eyes gave away his anticipation. He was 15, an age at which marriage was more an obligation than a romance, yet he wondered what this girl from the south, so praised for her beauty, would be like. He had grown tall and broad-shouldered, with hints of the man he would become. Catelyn had made certain he learned both the courtesy of a southern lord and the stoic dignity of a northern heir. He stood ready at Winterfell's gates on the day Margaery Tyrell and her entourage arrived. The day was crisp, the sky pewter gray. A gentle swirl of snow drifted around the battlements. It was hardly a blizzard, but for southerners unused to any more than the lightest dustings of winter, it might have felt like a herald of the cold. Margaery Tyrell, wrapped in a heavy cloak of green velvet trimmed with fur, emerged from her carriage. Her cheeks were flushed, her lips parted in a small smile as she took in the courtyard. To see Winterfell was to realize, perhaps, that she would be as far from the gentle warmth of Highgarden as she had ever been. Yet there was no flicker of apprehension in her eyes, only wonder. Robb stepped forward. "Welcome to Winterfell, Lady Margaery," he said, bowing with the politeness that Catelyn had taught him. He carried neither sword nor shield. This was meant to be a formal greeting, not a martial one. "I trust your journey was not too difficult." Margaery curtsied, graceful even as her skirts brushed against a thin layer of snow. She looked up at Robb, measuring him with a bright gaze. "It was long, my lord, but the welcome more than makes up for it. It is an honor to stand in your home." Behind her, Mace Tyrell exhaled loudly, brushing flecks of snow from his sleeve. "We have arrived at last. The air is sharp as a knife. I would have come more quickly, but my dear mother insisted on traveling with too many carts of supplies." At that, Lady Olenna Redwine, the Queen of Thorns, let out a sniff. "I do not trust the North to have the spices needed for a proper meal," she quipped. "From what I hear, they boil everything in salt." Catelyn greeted them graciously, ignoring Olenna's barbed remark with a good-natured smile. "We do our best to keep variety in our kitchens, Lady Olenna. Perhaps you'll find some local flavors that please you too." The Tyrells, escorted by the Starks and followed by a retinue of knights and servants, wound their way through Winterfell's stone passages to the great hall where a roaring fire was already warming the space. The grand wooden chairs were positioned near the dais. Ned Stark, who had arrived a few days earlier, stood by, that familiar paternal calm about him. He and Mace Tyrell exchanged courtesies. Ned offered the official welcome. Mace responded with the flowery language of the South, praising Winterfell's storied history and House Stark's honorable lineage. Margaery, her cloak now carried by a maid, stood near her father with a placid smile, eyes quietly darting about, taking in every corner of her new surroundings. At length, Ned stood, calling for attention. "My lords, my ladies, we are gathered here to welcome our esteemed guests from Highgarden who have traveled far under the king's blessing. Tonight, we celebrate the betrothal of my son and heir, Robb Stark, to the Lady Margaery Tyrell. May this union bring prosperity to both houses and strengthen the realm." A cheer went up from the gallery of Winterfell folk and the Tyrell knights alike. That evening's feast was a modest affair by southern standards. Winterfell was not known for outlandish banquets, but the tables boasted hearty fare: roast venison, warm bread, honeyed carrots, spiced apples, and casks of ale. The Tyrell contingent seemed impressed, or at least politely so. Robb took the seat of honor beside Margaery, and though the talk between them was tentative at first, Catelyn could see her son relax into conversation as the night wore on. Margaery asked him about the direwolves. She had heard the tales, each Stark child with a wolf companion. Robb's was Grey Wind, a lean, intelligent creature that followed him faithfully. Robb, smiling, spoke of the day they found the pups near their dead mother and how each pup gravitated to a different child. Margaery's eyes shone with fascination, though she tilted her head and asked if the wolves were truly tame or if they still harbored the wildness of their nature. Robb's grin widened, and he assured her that they were loyal and loving, especially to their chosen Stark. Lady Olenna at a nearby table observed them with hawk-like interest, occasionally offering a snide comment about the North's chill or its sturdy customs. Still, underneath that prickliness, one could sense she cared for her granddaughter's future. Ned watched her closely, remembering what he knew of Olenna's cunning. If the Tyrell matriarch approved of the union, that would quell many potential disruptions. As the days passed, Margaery and Robb were afforded time to speak in private, often walking the grounds of Winterfell with Grey Wind or talking near the Godswood's ancient heart tree. Sansa trailed them once or twice, starry-eyed at the romance of it all. Margaery, for her part, made an effort to get to know the family. She complimented Arya's feisty nature, though Arya rolled her eyes and listened patiently to Bran's raptures about climbing. With Lady Catelyn, she was all warmth and courtesy, ensuring that the older woman saw her not as some interloper but as a willing daughter by marriage. One evening, a mild snowfall dusted the courtyard, and Margaery wandered outside to see how the frost glimmered under torchlight. She found Robb leaning against a stone wall, wearing a thick cloak of wolf fur. Grey Wind lay at his feet. She paused, half expecting him to greet her with the usual civility. Instead, he looked at her with curiosity. "You're not cold?" he asked. Her cheeks were flushed pink. "No colder than I expected. It's rather beautiful. Like a new world." She brushed a bit of snow from her cloak. "I wonder, do you remember your first snowfall?" Robb paused. "We Northerners don't so much remember our first snowfall as realize we've been living in winter half our lives," he said with a slight laugh. "I can't recall a time when the cold wasn't a friend or an old acquaintance." She considered that, nibbling her lower lip. "And do you wish for the warmth of the South? Ever?" He shrugged. "It's said that winter is coming always. The Starks have our words for a reason. If you spend too long yearning for the warmth, you'll miss the splendor of the snow." Margaery nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps it's the same with roses, in a way. You tend them, you water them, you protect them from harsh winds. But if you cannot appreciate their thorns, you miss their true beauty." Robb studied her then, as if seeing beyond the polite veneer. Margaery's gaze held a certain quiet determination. He realized she was not a shallow Southern girl, but someone who recognized the complexities hidden beneath the surface. "I think I understand," he said. She extended a hand, brushing light fingers through Grey Wind's fur. The wolf tolerated her touch, which was a good sign. Margaery smiled and looked to Robb again. "I look forward to the day I can call Winterfell my home." He inclined his head gently. "I hope it can be a warm home, Fo. Are you, in all the ways that truly matter?" So their courtship progressed. Soon, the day for the official betrothal ceremony arrived. In the Godwood, before the Weirwood's ancient face, its features worn smooth by centuries of wind and worship, Ned Stark stood with Robb, Margaery, and a handful of close family and important witnesses. While Margaery's devotion to the Seven was not ignored, a small private sept ceremony would follow. The Starks insisted that this northern tradition be observed. The heart tree was older than any of them could comprehend, and in its presence, words carried a certain weight. Robb took Margaery's hands in his own. He spoke softly, vowing before the old gods to protect and cherish her, to stand by her side, to share in her joys and her sorrows. Margaery, for her part, repeated similar vows, her voice sure. The ground was damp with snowmelt, the air still, as though the forest held its breath. When they finished, Ned announced that Robb Stark and Margaery Tyrell were now officially betrothed in the eyes of the North. In the weeks that followed, final details of the wedding planned for the next year were discussed. But the Tyrells, never missing an opportunity for spectacle, suggested an earlier date might be beneficial for the realm, tying their families quickly, ensuring that if danger flared in King's Landing or beyond, the match could not be undone. Ned considered the suggestion. The king, after all, had wanted the arrangement soon. But perhaps Margaery needed time to adjust to the north and both families to settle the details. Ultimately, they agreed to hold the wedding in Winterfell before the coming harvest ended. That left only a few months. Enough time to gather lords from both the north and the Reach, but not so much that the realm's political tides might shift drastically. With that said, Margaery's father, Mace, decided to remain in Winterfell for a short while to finalize wedding details, then return to Highgarden to rally a proper retinue for his daughter's wedding. Lady Olenna, claiming her bones were too old for such constant travel, intended to stay behind with Margaery in the north until the wedding day. And so began the next chapter of Margaery Tyrell's new life. While other southern ladies might have bemoaned the cold stone corridors and the swirling northern mists, she simply requested heavier cloaks and quietly immersed herself in learning the ways of her future home. She walked the walls of Winterfell with Robb, speaking with stewards and guards to understand how the castle was run. She asked Maester Luwin about how the food stores were prepared to withstand the long winters. She spoke to the small folk in the courtyard, to the stable hands and the cooks, always with that gentle but unwavering smile, winning them over one by one. Some might have found this approach unnerving. Certainly, Lady Olenna teased her granddaughter about making friends with every butcher and baker. But Ned and Catelyn, while watchful, found it rather endearing. If Margaery's presence could unite the great houses while also forging a genuine bond with the people, then the union was all the stronger. Robb himself was the most taken aback by how easily Margaery settled into the flow of life in Winterfell. One day, he found her by the practice yard, observing the men at arms. The clang of steel rang out as some of his father's guards sparred. Margaery did not flinch. When Robb approached, she turned and asked, with more than polite interest, how a castle the size of Winterfell maintained readiness in times of peace. Robb laughed, pulling off his gloves. Father says peace is the best time for training. We keep the men disciplined, rotate them in and out of patrols, so that if war comes, they're not caught idle. Wise, she said, arching an eyebrow. And do you train as well? Every day, he replied. Sometimes with Theon, my father's ward, and sometimes with the master at arms. You're welcome to watch, if you wish. So she did, and after an hour, when Robb was done with his sword drills, she ventured onto the packed dirt of the yard. She lifted a wooden practice sword, feeling its weight. Might I? She asked. He blinked. You want to try? A laugh danced in her eyes. I've watched my brother Loras since I was small. I'm sure I'm nowhere near as skilled as he is or as you are, but I'd like to hold the blade just once. He handed her the wooden sword, amused but respectful. She gave it a few experimental swings. Her form was sloppy, but she handled it without shrinking back. He gently corrected her stance, placing a hand at her elbow. Her cheeks warmed at his touch, but she did not break focus. She tried a thrust, and he had to sidestep to avoid it, chuckling. Fearsome, he teased, although the strike was slow. Perhaps I should stick to embroidering direwolves instead, she replied lightly, returning the wooden sword. But I do appreciate the chance to see how it feels. Later, Robb would tell his mother of that little exchange, and Catelyn would simply smile, seeing how her son's eyes lit up at the mention of his betrothed. Ned, for his part, found some relief that the young couple seemed to be forging a bond rooted in more than simple duty. They were different, yes, the Rose of Highgarden and the Wolf of the North. But difference need not be a wedge. It could be a bridge. In the midst of all this, ravens continued to arrive from King's Landing. Some letters bore the king's seal, mostly short messages from Robert praising the match, promising to attend the wedding if he could. Others contained the silent tensions of the realm. Whispers that the Lannisters were amassing men, rumors that the Iron Islands were growing restless, talk that trouble brewed across the sea with the Targaryen girl who had married a Dothraki Khal. Eddard Stark read them all and felt the storm clouds gathering. This marriage could be a shield if war came. Or it could be a fresh battlefield if used incorrectly. One day, a raven arrived with a coded message from Luwin's old contact at the Citadel. The word was that the Crown's debts to the Iron Bank were mounting, that the royal treasury was effectively empty despite a facade of continued feast spending. Ned told Catelyn privately that Robert's financial mismanagement might be an easy angle for the Lannisters to tighten their hold on the throne. The Tyrell alliance then was all the more important. If the Crown needed coin, the Tyrells could provide. If the Tyrells and Starks formed a unified bloc, they could potentially outmaneuver Lannister influence. But that would require Margaery and Robb to become more than just a pleasant couple. They would need to stand firm together as leaders. Ned watched them from afar as the betrothal period progressed. He saw how Robb's sense of responsibility matured under Margaery's gentle questioning, how Margaery took interest not only in the pageantry but in the logistics of rulership. When trouble arose, such as a small dispute between two local clans over grazing rights, she sat in quietly while Ned and Robb discussed it, learning what it meant to hold justice. She asked pointed, thoughtful questions. She displayed a willingness to see different perspectives. "It is a pity your family's words are not as direct as House Stark's," Margaery commented once to Robb in private. "Growing strong, we Tyrells say, but I wonder how that helps us hold ourselves accountable to those who depend on us." Robb shrugged, thoughtful. "Stark say winter is coming, meaning we must always be ready for hardship. Perhaps your words remind you to always be more than you were before." She considered that, then smiled. "You always find the good in things, Robb Stark." He looked at her with the quiet sincerity that had begun to define him. "Only because I've been taught to. My father is not a cunning man, he's an honorable one. Sometimes that's dangerous, but it's how I want to live." She reached for his hand. "And I will stand beside you in honor or in danger." As the day of the wedding drew nearer, guests began arriving from the north and the Reach. Lords of the north, such as the Mandoleys from White Harbor and the Glovers from Deepwood Motte, came with small retinues. From the Reach came vassals of House Tyrell, Florence, Fossaways, Tarleys, Oakharts, and others. All were curious about this match. Many came bearing gifts or at least good wishes, though a few clearly had come to see how well Margaery was faring in the austere stronghold of Winterfell. The great courtyard filled with the bustle of arrivals, the stables filled with horses from far-off places. The local village outside Winterfell's walls saw an influx of travelers packed with soldiers and merchants hoping to profit from the event. Inside the castle, the cooks prepared day and night, large cauldrons of stews and ovens full of bread and meat pies. Barrels of ale and mead were stacked in the cellars. Lady Olenna, never shy, oversaw the addition of southern spices and requested fresh fruits, though the north had limited supply. She managed to secure lemons, evidently part of her personal stock, which she claimed was essential for good lemon cakes. Sansa was thrilled at that, for she had grown fond of the sweet southern treats. On the eve of the wedding, a hush of excitement lay over Winterfell like the hush before dawn. That night, Robb and Margaery observed the tradition of keeping separate vigils in their respective faiths, Robb in the Godwood, Margaery in a small sept that had been hastily adorned within the castle walls. Yet each of them was restless. Robb knelt under the heart tree, thoughts swirling with a mix of nerves and resolve. What kind of husband would he be? Would he prove a capable lord of Winterfell someday? Could he protect Margaery from whatever storms might come from King's Landing? He thought of his father and how the man's sense of duty always guided him. Robb vowed, silently, to follow that example. In the small sept, flickering with candlelight, Margaery stood in silent prayer. But her mind, too, roamed far and wide, from the rose-blanketed fields of Highgarden to the wind-lashed ramparts of Winterfell. She had come to respect the old gods, even if they were strange to her. She found their silent presence in the towering trees oddly comforting. And she admired the fortitude of the Starks. She knew her father's ambitions played a part in this match, and King Robert's political aims as well, but she hoped that beyond all that, she and Robb would forge something genuine and enduring. She clasped her hands together, whispered her prayers, and asked the Seven to watch over the realm. She had a feeling storms were gathering. The wedding might be the start of something that would shape the fate of Westeros. At last, dawn arrived. The wedding was a grand affair by northern standards, though modest in the eyes of some southerners. The day began with a ceremony in the Godwood. Robb and Margaery exchanged their vows before the heart tree, with Ned Stark presiding, joined by Lady Olenna, who muttered about the cold making her joints ache, and a gathering of lords and ladies. The air was cool but not bitter, and a few stray blossoms clung to the branches around the pool. The old gods bore witness in silence, the only sound the rush of the weirwood leaves overhead. Then, for the sake of Margaery's faith, a septon traveled from White Harbor, officiating a brief ceremony in the newly arranged sept space. The guests crammed inside, and Margaery wore a wreath of northern winter roses. Her gown was a blend of southern style and northern practicality, long sleeves trimmed with fur, a bodice embroidered with golden roses, and a cloak in stark gray. Robb, for his part, wore simple but dignified attire. A dark tunic, the dire wolf sigil in silver thread, and a heavy cloak clasped at his shoulder with a silver wolf's head. When the septon pronounced them husband and wife in the eyes of the Seven, Robb lifted Margaery's hand and gave it a light kiss. Applause echoed in the sept, mingling with hushed excitement. Outside, the courtyard erupted in cheers as the newlyweds emerged. The feast that followed spanned the entire day, with tables laden with food, music echoing off the stone walls, and dances in the torchlit hall. Margaery and Robb made a graceful couple on the dance floor. He was not the most graceful dancer, being more a swordsman, but she guided him gently, smiling, letting him lead as custom demanded, yet surreptitiously ensuring he did not stumble. Her gown swirled around them, and he found it hard to tear his eyes away from her. They parted occasionally to dance with other guests out of courtesy, but their gazes kept drifting back to each other. Meanwhile, Lords of the North conversed, sometimes awkwardly, with Lords of the Reach. The Tarleys debated hunting techniques with the Umbers. The Florents eyed the Manderleys with suspicion or curiosity. But many common toasts were raised to the young couple's health, and the overall mood was one of hopeful celebration. Late into the night, with the hall still echoing with music and laughter, Ned Stark caught sight of his son seeing Margaery from the Great Hall. They would share their first night in the Lord's chambers. Ned exhaled slowly, glancing at Catelyn, who watched them with eyes full of emotion. Their boy had stepped into a role that would shape the rest of his life. If only peace would hold. If only the realm would not tear itself apart. Perhaps, if they nurtured this alliance well, the bond of the wolf and the rose would help keep Westeros from fracturing. For a time, Winterfell settled into an unaccustomed sense of harmony. Margaery's presence brought a gentle southern warmth to the old halls. She introduced small touches to the decor, arrangements of dried flowers, embroidered hangings that blended Stark and Tyrell sigils. The library found new texts from the Reach, courtesy of traveling septons who carried manuscripts on horticulture, history, even poetry. Sansa became a frequent companion, soaking in Margaery's knowledge of southern courtly ways. Arya remained aloof, though occasionally Margaery would surprise her with interest in archery or sword lore, something that made Arya grudgingly admit Margaery was not as silly as she'd thought. Robb, now a married man at 16, took on new responsibilities. Ned allowed him to sit in on more of Winterfell's daily governance. Sometimes Margaery joined them, and together they would discuss matters ranging from harvest yields to settlement of disputes among bannermen. Margaery offered mild suggestions gleaned from her upbringing in the fertile Reach about crop rotations and storing grain. Robb found her ideas insightful. She was no timid lady content to sit at an embroidery frame all day. She wanted to help rule wisely, and that stirred both respect and affection in him. When the Raven arrived from King's Landing, carrying news that Jon Arryn's death was rumored to be no mere illness, that rumor flared that the Lannisters might be behind it and that King Robert himself might be in danger, Ned Stark's brow darkened. War had not come yet, but it loomed. The Game of Thrones never ceased. Ned gathered Robb, Margaery, and Catelyn to discuss the danger. "We must tread carefully," he warned them. "If the realm divides, House Lannister on one side, perhaps House Baratheon on another, we cannot stand alone. Nor can the Tyrells stand alone. This marriage is a bond, yes, but we must make sure it becomes a shield for our people." Catelyn reached for Ned's hand. "What will you do, my lord?" He considered. "Robert wants me by his side, but I cannot leave Winterfell undefended. Margaery's father has returned to Highgarden, presumably to muster some show of strength should the situation worsen. We'll remain vigilant." Margaery and Robb exchanged glances. They knew that if matters escalated, they might have to prove the worth of their union on a battlefield, not just in the feasting hall. Yet they also knew that if they stood firm, if the Starks and Tyrells presented a united front, the Lannisters might think twice before unleashing chaos. And so, in the months that followed, a tenuous peace lingered in the air. Margaery and Robb's marriage became a beacon of hope, two great houses, bridging north and south, forging a bond that might keep the realm from unraveling. The smallfolk whispered that the wolf and the rose made a handsome couple. Knights sang ballads of their union, romanticizing the idea of a southern flower thriving in the northern snow. But behind the curtains of daily life, letters flew, alliances were tested, and the lines of conflict that had once been faint began to darken. Word spread quietly that Cersei Lannister hated this new alliance. She saw it as a threat to her children's future. Tywin Lannister might be more measured, but he would not sit idly if the Tyrells and Starks blocked his influence. And in the east, the exiled Targaryen princess was said to be forging alliances of her own. Meanwhile, King Robert, unaware or willfully ignorant of half the intrigues around him, sent out a casual order for a grand tournament in King's Landing meant to honor Ned Stark as hand. Little did he know that half the lords of the realm would use it as an excuse to gauge each other's strength. Ned, now more cautious than ever, decided he would travel south at King Robert's request, if only to keep an eye on the king. Margaery and Robb, however, would remain in Winterfell. Ned wanted his new daughter-in-law safe, and he wanted Robb to grow more comfortable in the role of caretaker. Should war break out, Winterfell must stand strong. At first, Robb protested. He wanted to accompany his father, but Ned gently reminded him of his duty. You are the Lord of Winterfell in my absence, Robb. Keep Margaery safe. Keep your mother and your siblings safe. Robb bowed his head. Yes, father. Margaery quietly supported Ned's decision. If the realm needed Stark leadership in King's Landing, then so be it. But she feared for Ned's safety. She had seen enough of courtly intrigue to know that honor was rarely rewarded there. Ned, for his part, comforted her with a soft smile, telling her to watch over Robb and remain vigilant. The day Ned Stark rode south, the courtyard was hushed. Robb stood on the steps with Margaery beside him, her arm through his. Catelyn, pale but composed, gave Ned a tight hug goodbye. Sansa and Arya tried to hold back tears. Bran clung to his father before the old knight, Ser Roderick Castle, helped Ned mount. The party departed at a steady pace, and for a while, Margaery and Robb stood in silence, gazing after them. Then, when the last banners disappeared down the King's Road, they turned back into Winterfell's halls. It feels quieter already, Margaery said softly. Robb nodded. Yes, but we have work to do. Father left plenty of tasks for us. They settled into their routine. Margaery learned more of the day-to-day running of Winterfell. Robb personally oversaw the training of the men-at-arms. Catelyn handled many of the diplomatic letters. In every corner, signs of commingled traditions flourished. Tyrell bannermen still stationed in the north, forging friendships with Stark soldiers, Margaery's ladies-in-waiting, who strolled the Godwood in southern gowns, warming themselves under thick cloaks as the days grew shorter. In time, ravens brought updates. The King's Tournament had been overshadowed by tragedy, Ser Hugh of the Vale died in the lists, and rumors pointed at deeper manipulations. Then came the dire news. Ned Stark, investigating Jon Arryn's death, had run afoul of the Lannisters. King Robert was at odds with his own queen. Whispers of bastardy in the royal line were circulating. The realm stood on the brink of chaos. One morning, as Robb and Margaery broke fast with Catelyn, a raven arrived. The message within bore the seal of House Stark, but the script was hurried. It warned of betrayal at court, that Ned had discovered a secret, and the Lannisters might move against him. The message ended abruptly, advising the family to muster their strength, to prepare for the worst. Robb's hand shook as he read. They might kill him, he muttered, voice taut with fear and anger. Catelyn rose, face set like stone. They will not take your father so easily, but we must do as he asks. Gather our bannermen. If war comes, we must be ready. Margaery closed her eyes, exhaling a steadying breath. I will send word to my father as well. Highgarden must be informed. If the Lannisters hold King Robert's ear, the Tyrells must stand firm with us. Catelyn gripped Margaery's hand. You would do that? Margaery nodded without hesitation. Yes, my father covets influence, but he will not stand idly if the Lannisters threaten his daughter's new family. Though it may mean a fight, he will not abandon us. If the king has truly lost control of his queen, the Tyrells will be forced to choose a side. We must give them good reason to choose ours, and the reason is this bond between me and Robb. Robb's breath came in short bursts, adrenaline coursing. He was young, but he had always known this day might come. A day when House Stark might have to fight for its honor. He looked at Margaery, at her determined gaze, and found in it a reflection of his own resolve. He reached for her hand. We will stand together, then. She squeezed his hand in return, eyes shining. The wolf and the rose, she said softly. Together, and so the call to arms went out. Ravens flew from Winterfell, summoning northern lords to gather at Moat Cailin. Missives sped to Highgarden, urging Mace Tyrell to prepare if the Lannisters seized power in King's Landing and threatened the alliance. The war drums had not yet sounded, but everyone felt them in the silence between heartbeats. In the courtyards of Winterfell, men drilled with renewed fervor. Robb conferred with Roose Bolton, Wyman Manderly, and other lords who began to arrive with their men. Catelyn wrote letter after letter, urging House Tully in the Riverlands to be ready. Margaery spent hours with Lady Olenna, who had remained in Winterfell this whole time, quietly directing Tyrell knights to secure key positions. Olenna might have seemed a crusty old woman, but she had the cunning of a seasoned courtier. Through it all, Marjorie continued to accompany Robb. She rode with him to inspect the mustering of soldiers. She encouraged him when he doubted his readiness for command. She used her charm to soothe tensions among lords who might otherwise bicker. More than once, Robb privately admitted to her that he did not feel ready to lead an army. She would take his hands and remind him that the North believed in him and that if he led with honor, they would follow. Then she would add, with a hint of a wry smile, "And you have the backing of Highgarden if we can just prompt my father to move swiftly." In the gloom of an overcast day, news finally reached them. Ned Stark had been seized by the Lannisters. King Robert had been gravely injured in a hunting accident and died soon after, leaving Joffrey Baratheon, Cersei's child, to claim the throne. War looked inevitable. Catelyn paled as she read the Raven's words. She pressed her lips tightly and shut her eyes, as if trying to contain the grief for a man not yet confirmed dead. Robb clenched his jaw so hard it hurt. "They will not kill him," he said, as if trying to will it true. "He's too valuable." Marjorie's voice trembled, though she kept it low. "We must hope so. But Joffrey is said to be capricious." Lady Olenna snorted from her seat. "Capricious is too kind a word. That boy is a monstrous little fiend, from all I've heard. The Lannister blood runs hot in him, and this so-called claim to the throne might be built on rotten foundations. So we fight," Roose Bolton said quietly from across the table. "To free Lord Stark, to unseat the Lannisters if we can, or at least to secure our own independence." Catelyn pressed her fingers to her temple. "Independence will shatter the realm. Is that truly wise?" Robb's voice, though young, cut through the clamor. "I don't want to break the realm apart," he said. "I only want my father safe. But if they intend to name Joffrey king, and if he intends to murder my father, we must act quickly. We can march south. We have the bannermen. The Tyrells can meet us. Together, we can force their hand." Marjorie gazed at him, heart-pounding. "I will write to my father again, urging him to move. He may have planned to wait and see which way the wind blew. But the wind is blowing now. They agreed to muster the North's armies. The lords pledged their swords to Robb, swearing him as the king in the North if it came to that." Marjorie knew this would put Highgarden in a difficult position. If Robb declared independence as king in the North, would the Tyrells follow? Or would they remain loyal to the Iron Throne, thus severing Marjorie's marriage bond? She was certain her father would weigh every advantage, but in the end, the Tyrells hated the Lannisters enough to consider an alliance with the Starks. In a matter of weeks, Winterfell's courtyard was filled with thousands of men, banners fluttering, the direwolf of Stark, the sunburst of Karstark, the flayed man of Bolton, which always made Marjorie shudder, the merman of Manderley, and so on. Robb would lead them south, a boy no longer, but a lord, and possibly a king, forced by war to test his mettle. Marjorie insisted on traveling with him at least as far as Moat Cailin to help coordinate with the Tyrell forces. Catelyn gave her blessing, though she cautioned Marjorie to be careful once actual hostilities began. When the day came for the host to depart, Marjorie wore riding leathers under her cloak, standing beside her husband in the courtyard. A hush settled as he addressed his men, reminding them they rode to rescue Lord Stark and to protect the honor of the North. They cheered, beating spear butts on the ground. Then Robb turned to Marjorie, placing a hand gently on her cheek. "My lady," he said softly, "thank you for standing beside me." She managed a small smile, her heart twisting with dread and pride. "Where else would I stand?" she answered and kissed his palm. Together, they rode out. The roads beyond Winterfell teemed with the hustle of armed men, supply wagons, outriders. Marjorie's presence among them was something new. Many of the North's warriors, stern men who rarely saw southern ladies, were surprised but soon came to respect her quiet composure. She did not flinch from the grime or the cold, and though she was no soldier, she offered a voice of reason when arguments among lords flared. She corresponded daily with her father's camp, which was said to be mustering near the Reach's northern borders. If the realm had once been at peace, that time was gone. Across the Riverlands, armies began to march, lines of alliance were drawn and redrawn. Marjorie, traveling with Robb, felt the undercurrent of tension in every village they passed, in every farmstead where the inhabitants peered fearfully at the armed host. But the Stark forces treated the small folk with as much respect as they could manage. Robb insisted upon it. The North was harsh, but not cruel. Marjorie admired her husband all the more for his sense of honor, but she worried about whether honor alone could prevail against the ruthless cunning of the Lannisters. At Moat Cailin, they paused, forming ranks, readying for the march into the swamps of the Neck and beyond. Catelyn joined them, having left Winterfell in the capable hands of trusted castellans. She greeted Marjorie with an embrace, for she, too, realized war might separate them for a long time. Then the combined host continued south, with ravens flying back and forth between them and the Tyrell gathering forces near the Blackwater Rush. Marjorie's father finally replied with a decisive message. The Tyrell armies would meet Robb near Harrenhal's outskirts if they could bypass the Lannisters. Lord Tywin's forces were rumored to be maneuvering near the Trident, while Jaime Lannister pushed further into the Riverlands. It was a dangerous dance, with each side trying to outflank the other. The geography of war was unfolding like a lethal puzzle across the map of Westeros. And so, the Wolf of the North and the Rose of the Reach marched together, forging an alliance that might shape the very destiny of the Seven Kingdoms. With Robert's goodwill at the start and the quiet fury of the realm at its heart, they advanced, determined to free Ned Stark and challenge the Lannisters' hold on power. In distant corners, lords and small folk alike murmured that if House Stark and House Tyrell prevailed, the future of Westeros might be forever changed, guided by the earnest heart of a northern lord and the keen intellect of his southern lady. They rode on into the swirling uncertainties of war, each step of their horses echoing across the land like a promise that if the Wolf and the Rose stood united, then winter itself might yield to new growth and the realm might yet see the dawn of a better age, or descend into a deeper darkness if the dice of fate fell otherwise. But in that moment, as Robb Stark and Marjorie Tyrell clasped hands, leading their banners forward, hope, like a rose in the snow, still bloomed. The morning sun filtered through a gauze of clouds, revealing the sprawl of tents and horses that had overtaken the once empty fields at Moat Cailin. Winterfell's banners, proud direwolves stitched in gray and white, fluttered beside those of lesser northern houses. Umbers, Boltons, Manderleys, Serwyns, Glovers, and Karstarks all converged here in answer to Robb Stark's call. The mustering of a northern host was a rare sight indeed, but the men arrived in droves and in solemn purpose. Too many had heard the rumors that Eddard Stark was a prisoner in King's Landing, that Robert Baratheon was dead, that Joffrey wore the crown, and that the Lannisters would brand any who opposed them traitors. War was no longer a distant threat, it had become a looming certainty. For all the martial bustle, the ancient ruin of Moat Cailin lent a certain hush to the gathering. The three remaining towers stood like watchful ghosts from a bygone era. The swampy ground surrounding them offered a formidable natural defense, making this fortress the key to holding or crossing the neck. Soldiers sloshed through boggy patches, leading horses with care so none would break a leg in a hidden sinkhole. Ravens swept overhead, black shapes against the gray sky, carrying messages from camp to camp, from north to south. At the center of this organized chaos, Robb Stark and Marjorie Tyrell walked side by side, carefully picking their way through the mud as they moved from one cluster of tents to another. Robb wore a cloak pinned at his shoulder by a direwolf-shaped brooch. Marjorie's fur-trimmed mantle bore a subtle golden rose embroidered at the hem, and the ring she wore, set with a small emerald, glinted whenever a rare ray of sunlight caught it. Despite the uncertain terrain, a certain determination shone in their eyes. A hush fell among passing soldiers as they recognized their liege lord and his new lady. The men stepped aside, bowing heads, saluting, or doffing caps out of respect. Marjorie made it a point to meet their eyes and offer a cordial word or nod. The North was not the Reach, yet she intended to make these men feel that she was here for them, not merely for her own house's ambitions. "You've been well received," Robb murmured to her as they paused by a makeshift stable. Within, stable hands brushed horses that had carried riders from Bear Island to as far east as the coast. "My lords and knights say you speak to them with courtesy, that you learn their names and remember details of their homes. That's no small feat, considering how large the North is." Marjorie smiled a little, tucking a stray lock of brown hair behind her ear. The damp air made her curls cling to her temples. "It's not so difficult. Many of them talk gladly when given the chance. They're proud of you, of House Stark. And I think they appreciate that. Though I am Southern, I wish to understand the land I've married into. They tell me stories of their families, their hunts, the shape of the coast in White Harbor. It's quite fascinating." Robb caught her hand gently and squeezed it, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "It means more than you know. My father always taught me that a lord or a lady must care for his people, truly care, if they're to follow him into battle. Fear only carries an army so far. Loyalty carries it farther." She nodded. "Indeed. My father in Highgarden taught me that growing strong as a motto means nothing if we don't tend to the roots that feed us. My grandmother says the small folk are those roots. But I see clearly that the bannermen are also vital. Each man or woman who fights for the Starks has their own life, their own stories. If we forget that, we become no better than the Lannisters, seeing only pawns on a board." Robb's eyes flicked around the encampment, to the men setting up campfires and sharpening swords. "We will not be like the Lannisters," he said. "We march to free my father, to restore justice, not to crush the small folk or pillage the countryside." Arm in arm, they continued onward until they reached the largest tent at the heart of the camp. Guarding the tent flap stood 2 Stark men-at-arms in cloaks of gray. They saluted with fists to their chests. Robb inclined his head and stepped inside, gesturing for Margaery to follow. A swirl of lamplight and smoke from a nearby brazier greeted them. Within the dim interior, Catelyn Stark waited at a long wooden table along with the great lords who had come to support Robb's cause. Roose Bolton stood to one side, austere and pale of face, his expression always unreadable. Great John Umber loomed on the other side, a bear of a man with a booming laugh that seemed out of place in these tense times. Lord Rickard Karstark hovered near a map, while the Manderleys, Ser Wylis and his brother, occupied a space by the brazier, warming their hands. Also present, incongruously, was Lady Olenna Redwine, Margaery's formidable grandmother, perched on a stool, her posture as regal as if she sat on a throne. When Robb and Margaery stepped in, all eyes turned to them. Some bowed slightly in deference to Robb's status as Ned Stark's heir. Others offered nods that included Margaery. A hush fell, broken at last by Catelyn. "My son," she said softly. "We've been awaiting you." Robb nodded, pulling off his gloves and tucking them into his belt. Margaery swept forward to greet her grandmother with a light kiss to the cheek. Lady Olenna patted her granddaughter's hand and sniffed disapprovingly at the cold. Then all turned their attention to Robb. "What news do we have from scouts?" he asked, moving to the large table. On it lay a tattered map of the Neck and the Riverlands beyond, weighed at the corners by stones. Lord Karstark, his gray beard neatly trimmed, leaned forward. "My outriders report Lannister movements to the west. Tywin Lannister has an army near the God's Eye, close to Harrenhal. The other Lannister force, commanded by the Kingslayer, remains near Riverrun, harrying Tully lands. As of yet, there's no sign that they've advanced further north. The roads at the Twins remain open, though Walder Frey demands terms if we wish to cross in force." Margaery's eyes flicked over the map, remembering stories of the Freys. How cunning they were, how they held the crossing like a vice. House Tyrell had seldom dealt with them directly, but their reputation was hardly flattering. "Walder Frey," Catelyn said quietly, voice tight. "He will want a price for letting an army as large as ours cross unchallenged. We've known that from the start. And we'll pay that price if we must," Robb said, looking troubled. "But we have to be wary. Crossing the Twins will lead us deeper into the Riverlands, where we can link with Uncle Edmure. But Tywin will surely be watching for that." "How soon might the Tyrells join us?" asked Roose Bolton, his voice a quiet contrast to the thunderous tone of Great John Umber. Bolton's pale eyes flicked to Margaery. "We've had word they muster in the south, but war moves quickly." Margaery inhaled. "My father has raised the banners of the Reach. He marches north with a considerable force. The plan remains for him to bypass the Rose Road's vulnerabilities by traveling along less obvious routes, possibly through the Gold Road's back roads, or even around the Stormlands if Renly Baratheon chooses to remain neutral. They will aim to meet us near Harrenhal. The reason is strategic. If the Tyrells can approach from one direction, and the Starks from another, we can attempt to encircle or corner Tywin Lannister's main host." Lady Olenna tapped her cane on the ground. "My son is diligent, but not the speediest. However, the news of Ned Stark's imprisonment should stir him to action. For all his pomposity, Mace Tyrell will not let it be said that he dawdled while his daughter's new family was threatened." A faint laugh came from the Great John. "I'd like to see Lannister faces when they realize the Wolf has joined forces with the Rose. Let's see how Golden Lions fare against Northern Steel and Tyrell Knights." Catelyn's expression remained somber. "We mustn't underestimate them. The Lannisters are cunning, and they hold King's Landing through the boy King Joffrey. They have the power to strike at any lords who remain loyal to the crown but defy Lannister rule. It's not as if that boy is truly Baratheon," Lady Olenna said with a mocking huff. "Everyone with eyes can see he's a product of Cersei and that handsome brother of hers." Silence fell, thick with the weight of that accusation. In hushed corners, the rumor of Joffrey's parentage had spread. but speaking it openly was treason under the new regime. Robb finally spoke. Whether the rumor is true or not, the Lannisters have crowned him. We ride to free my father, and if possible, to make the realm see sense. If that means war, so be it. A murmur of assent passed around the circle. Then Catelyn lifted her chin. We also have the matter of Sansa. She remains in King's Landing, betrothed to Joffrey. Hostage might be a better word now. Robb's face tightened. We cannot leave her at their mercy. No, Catelyn agreed. But first, we must gather enough strength to make a demand. That means crossing into the Riverlands and uniting with Tully men. From there, we either face Jaime Lannister near Riverrun or attempt a thrust south to threaten King's Landing directly. In either case, we hope the Tyrells can strike from the south or west to prevent Lannister reinforcements. Marjorie placed a hand on Robb's shoulder. My father will not let us stand alone. The sooner our armies converge, the sooner we can apply pressure on King's Landing. They might be forced to negotiate if faced with a two-front war. Roose Bolton's lips curved in a barely perceptible smile. Negotiation would suit many, but we should be prepared for the possibility that the Lannisters will not yield. A muted silence followed, each lord lost in his own calculation of risk. Then Robb exhaled. We must move quickly. Let us begin by sending word to Walder Frey to arrange for crossing. We'll also dispatch riders to see if Tywin's host shifts. We march at first light. They dispersed, lords bowing, conversation continuing in hushed undertones as they left the tent. Olenna departed last, leaning on her cane, with Marjorie supporting her by the elbow. Robb lingered behind, exchanging a few quiet words with Catelyn. Marjorie could only imagine the heaviness in his heart at the thought of leading men into war while his father languished in a Lannister cell. Outside, the wind rustled through the high reeds. The smell of damp earth and campfires permeated the air. Marjorie walked Lady Olenna back to her own tent where her grandmother paused to rest on a folding chair. A servant girl stepped forward to offer a cup of watered wine. Olenna took it but didn't drink, her eyes sharp on her granddaughter. You've done well, dear, the old woman said quietly. The men like you and Robb seems more confident with you at his side. But keep your wits about you. War is no tourney pageant. I understand, Marjorie said, kneeling slightly to be at her grandmother's level. I did not come here expecting a fairy tale. I intend to do what I can to protect Robb and House Stark. For better or worse, they are our family now. Olenna regarded her in silence for a moment. Then, with a rare softness, she patted Marjorie's hand. The North can be brutal, but the men of Stark carry their honor like a shield. You remember that when you see the blood and chaos that war brings. Your role may be to remind them of compassion, or to remind them that cunning is sometimes needed when honor alone might fail. I'll remember, grandmother, Marjorie said. A small, satisfied nod. Off with you then. I'll have a rest before the business of tomorrow. I pray these northern tents won't leak in the night's rain. Marjorie took her leave and found Robb waiting outside the tent. The sky overhead had turned a dusky purple and a few stars flickered beyond the swirling clouds. She slid her arm through his and they walked together toward their own quarters, a larger tent set near the Watcher's perimeter where Robb could be found quickly if an alarm was sounded. Once inside, a pair of small braziers gave off enough heat to banish the worst of the evening chill. Robb sank onto a sturdy wooden chest, leaning forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. He looked up as she approached. Did my mother speak to you? He asked. She did, before the meeting. She's worried about your father, about Sansa, about all of it. Robb nodded heavily. So am I. Sometimes I feel as though I've been thrust into a role I'm not ready for. One moment, I'm learning how to be a lord, how to oversee Winterfell in father's absence. The next, I'm leading an entire army into war. Marjorie knelt before him, laying a hand atop his clasped fingers. No one is ever truly ready for war, Robb. Even my father, with all his tournaments and host, has never faced a conflict quite like this. We must rely on what we do know, that you are a fair, honorable leader, and that your men trust you. My grandmother says that's half the battle won. He gave a mirthless chuckle. Your grandmother is wise, but I'm afraid the other half is steel and cunning. Marjorie's gaze held his. We have cunning too, if we choose to wield it. We have the loyalty of the North, the power of the Reach, and the Tullus will surely join us. The Lannisters are formidable, but if we coordinate well, we can outmaneuver them. Trust in yourself and trust me if you will. I do, he whispered. He paused, searching for words. When I think of father in a cell, or worse. And Sansa alone among those vipers. She leaned in, pressing her forehead against his. They're alive, Robb. Cersei is not known for mercy, but even she must realize that harming Ned Stark outright would provoke the North to savage retribution. Holding him as a hostage gives them a bargaining chip. He drew a slow breath. I pray you're right. He kissed her then, a brief, weary kiss that spoke of gratitude and fear and the determination that lay beneath it all. She stood, helped him to his feet, and they prepared for what rest they could manage in this makeshift lodging. Tomorrow, the host would march south. War was upon them, and the path ahead promised blood and hardship. But together, they would face it. By dawn, the camp stirred with purposeful haste. Soldiers dismantled tents, loaded supply carts, and formed marching columns. Robb moved among them on horseback, his dire wolf, Grey Wind, loping at his side. Marjorie rode nearby, cloaked in fur, trying to ignore the anxious twist in her gut. Though her grandmother traveled in a covered wagon, Marjorie had chosen to ride, wanting to be visible to the men. She'd learned that morale often depended on such small gestures. Catelyn rode alongside them with a small guard of her own. Over the clatter of hooves on the muddy causeway, she leaned toward Marjorie to speak. I know this is not how we imagined your marriage to begin. Marjorie offered a thin smile. Nor I. I thought I'd have more time to settle at Winterfell, learn the rhythms of the North. Instead, we're swept into war. But I must do what I can. Catelyn nodded. I see my son leans on you more than you might realize. Your presence is a comfort to him. I only hope it's enough to see him through this, Marjorie said. Then, gently, I worry for you as well, my lady. You've had to leave Bran, Rickon, and Sansa behind. Pain flickered across Catelyn's face. Bran and Rickon remain at Winterfell under good guard. Arya is with us in a way, she insisted, though we've placed her under watch to keep her from mischief. Sansa is in King's Landing, betrothed to that boy. If I could, I'd snatch her away in a heartbeat. But I must trust that Ned's captivity will keep her alive. The Lannisters need her as a piece in their game. She paused, her voice soft with guilt. I hate thinking of my daughter as a piece. Marjorie's heart clenched in empathy. We will bring her home. All of them. They fell silent then, focusing on the trail ahead. The army passed through the narrow causeways that led out of the neck, trudging in long lines. Tall reeds and stagnant pools bracketed their path, and the men joked darkly about bog devils in the swamps. Occasional glimpses of crumbling watchtowers reminded them that many before had tried and failed to breach or defend these lands. At midday, they stopped to rest and water the horses. Robb and his commanders gathered around a small clearing, studying fresh reports from outriders. Marjorie drew aside, letting them speak of tactics while she oversaw the distribution of bread, cheese, and salted meat to some of the foemen. She remembered how, in Highgarden, the servants and small folk always seemed somewhat removed from the nobility, living separate lives. But here, the lines blurred in war. Everyone huddled in the same damp fields, relied on the same supply wagons, felt the same chill in their bones. At one point, she paused to take a drink from a water flask. A young foot soldier, no older than 16, recognized her. He bowed clumsily, cheeks red. My lady, thank you for seeing to us. I'm from Lord Serwyn's lands. She smiled, handing him a hunk of bread. If we're to fight together, we must care for one another. He looked surprised at her words, but grateful. She watched him hurry off, then turned to find Robb standing nearby. He had dismounted and was regarding her with the faintest hint of a smile on his lips. You do that well, he said. Do what? Make them feel seen, he replied. It's something my father was always good at. I've tried, but you have a warmth about you. They respond to that. She touched his arm lightly. They also respond to you, Robb. You're not just the son of Eddard Stark, you're their leader now, and they sense you care. When we stand side by side like this, it shows unity. No man wants to lay down his life for lords or ladies who look down on him. His features softened, though tension still lined his brow. Unity, he echoed. The wolf and the rose. I pray it's enough. They resumed the march, pushing deeper into the Riverlands over the next few days. The weather grew gentler, though storms threatened. Refugees from burned-out villages appeared on the roads, carrying meager belongings and stories of Lannister men raiding farmsteads near the border. Outrage simmered in the northern ranks. Many men had kin in the Riverlands, or at least felt a kinship through Catelyn's Tully roots. With each new atrocity shared by terrified smallfolk, the army's resolve hardened. Once, near a shallow creek, they came upon a group of ragged peasants burying their dead in hastily dug graves. Robb halted the column long enough to speak to them, ensuring they had food, offering what assistance the army's healers could spare. Marjorie stood at his side, helping distribute bandages to an elderly woman with a gash on her arm. It was the lions, my lord, the woman whispered shakily. Men with golden armor, they took our cows, burned the storehouse. Said we were harboring Tully men. Rob's jaw clenched. I'm sorry. They left the survivors with a small escort of soldiers to guide them toward safety deeper in Tully territory. As the army moved on, Marjorie glanced at Rob, who wore a grim expression. That's just a taste of what the Lannisters do, he said quietly. If my father were free, he would demand Robert put a stop to it. But the king is dead and Joffrey won't reign in his own men. Marjorie spoke with quiet conviction. Then we must be the ones to put a stop to it. One evening they camped along the banks of the Green Fork. A raven arrived from Riverrun bearing Edmure Tully's words. He was under siege by Jaime Lannister's forces, but holding for now. Another message arrived from Mace Tyrell confirming his progress north. He expected to cross into the Crownlands within a fortnight. The plan remained for a coordinated strike, but Tywin's movements were uncertain. In Rob's command tent, the Northern Lords debated their next step. We can't leave Riverrun under siege, Great John Umber declared. That's your mother's seat, boy. Tully men will join us if we free them. Catelyn inhaled sharply, the lines at her eyes deepening. My brother is besieged. We must do something. Roose Bolton nodded, though his voice was measured. A direct confrontation with Jaime Lannister could be dangerous. He has fewer men than Tywin, but he's no slouch at warfare. Perhaps we can outflank him. If we approach from the north, we might slip behind him, cut off his supply lines. Lord Rickard Karstark frowned. And if Tywin Lannister moves east from Harrenhal, we could be caught between them like a hammer and anvil. Rob's gaze drifted to Marjorie, then to the map. Is there a way to coordinate with my father-in-law's forces, ensure that Tywin has to divide his attention? Marjorie stepped closer, scanning the ink-drawn roads. My father's forces are large, but if Tywin Lannister sees them coming, he could retreat toward the capital or fortify Harrenhal. The question is, do we risk a siege at Harrenhal, or do we let Tywin slip away and join the rest of the Lannisters near King's Landing? A heavy quiet descended. Catelyn leaned over the map, pointing at the twins. We can cross here. Lord Frey's toll is steep, but it's the swiftest route to Riverrun. Alternatively, we could try crossing at Fairmarket or further downriver, but that risks running into Lannister scouts or outriders. Time is pressing. Edmure won't hold forever. Rob pressed his palms on the table. Then we speak with Walder Frey. Pay what we must, as distasteful as it may be, to cross the twins. We'll approach Riverrun from the north. With luck, we can catch Jaime between our host and the castle garrison. If Tywin moves to relieve him, that might buy enough time for the Tyrells to strike at Harrenhal or even King's Landing. The Great John barked a laugh. A bold plan, but boldness is what we need. Bolton's eyes shifted like a snake's. We must ensure that Walder Frey doesn't betray us to the Lannisters. He'll do anything for gold or advantage. Catelyn lifted her head. I'll talk to him. He's always wanted to see his line more illustrious. Perhaps we can promise a good marriage match in return for safe passage. But I'll do whatever is necessary. My brother needs us. Marjorie hesitated, glancing at Rob. The entire shape of the war seemed to hinge on how quickly they could rescue Riverrun and whether the Tyrells could converge in time to keep Tywin from overshadowing them. She thought about the Lannisters in King's Landing, Cersei, Joffrey, perhaps Tyrion, though she'd never met him. They would not sit idle. But for now, the plan was set. They would cross at the twins. When the meeting adjourned, Catelyn immediately began drafting a letter to Walder Frey. Marjorie stayed behind with Rob, studying the map in moody silence. Outside the tent, the last vestiges of daylight had faded and the chirr of insects rose from the waterside. Rob walked around the table and gently touched her arm. You're quiet, he said. She offered a thin smile. Just thinking of all the ways this could go wrong. But you're right, it must be done. We can't abandon Riverrun. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. It's our best chance. Besides, if we free Riverrun, we gain more men and secure a base in the Riverlands. Tywin won't be able to ignore us if we retake the Tully seat. She leaned her head against his chest. And your father? If we succeed, we might force the Lannisters to bargain for peace. That might be the best chance of freeing him. He nodded. Yes, though I still fear Joffrey's whims. I hear stories that the boy is cruel. But if we can show him that war is unwinnable, maybe we can force an exchange, my father and sisters, for a treaty. They stood there in the hush, the weight of possibility pressing on them. Marjorie listened to the beat of Rob's heart, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself a small flicker of optimism. Soon, the northern host was on the move once more. With each league south, the Riverland's lush fields and winding streams replaced the next boggy landscape. The men's spirits, buoyed by the thought of drawing nearer to their Tully allies, rose somewhat. Still, tension crackled. Scouts rode ahead, wary of running into Lannister outriders. On the horizon, a haze of smoke occasionally marked villages sacked by roving bands of soldiers. No one was certain whether they were Lannisters, bandits, or some lesser lord's men turned brigand. They traveled with discipline. Robb insisted on strict orders against looting or harming small folk, though they had to take provisions, grain, hay for horses, salt fish. They did so lawfully, promising compensation where possible. The difference between them and the Lannisters did not go unnoticed by the peasants. More than a few approached Margaery and Robb with tearful gratitude, offering small tokens of thanks, a loaf of fresh bread, a jar of honey, despite having so little. Finally, spires of stone jutted up on the horizon, the twins, two massive castles flanking the green fork of the Trident with a great stone bridge spanning the water. Walder Frey's fortress was not the grandest in Westeros, but it was the only safe crossing for a large army for many leagues. A line of tents rose on the far side, indicating that Walder Frey was prepared for negotiations and for a siege if those negotiations went sour. Robb, Catelyn, Margaery, and a select guard approached under a flag of truce. At the gates, they were met by a few of Walder Frey's brood, black-haired, sharp-faced men wearing the two-towered sigil. With all the courtesy they could muster, they escorted the visitors inside, through the gates, past the open courtyard, and into a dim great hall. Walder Frey himself, an ancient, wrinkled figure, sat in a high-backed chair, surrounded by a swarm of children, grandchildren, and other relatives. Catelyn went forward, inclining her head. "Lord Frey." He let out a wet chuckle. "Cat Tully, come home to pay respects, have you? Or do you only come because your father's halls are under siege and you need my crossing?" Catelyn kept her composure. "You know why I'm here." His eyes flicked to Robb, then to Margaery. "Ah, the young wolf. And you've brought your southern rose. A new alliance, I hear. Good for you." He cackled unpleasantly. "Such a rush you're all in. War's a messy business." Despite the old man's rudeness, Margaery dipped her head in greeting. Walder Frey's watery blue eyes trailed over her, evaluating. She remained still, wearing a faint polite smile, the way one might face a questionable ally at court. Walder Frey sniffed. "Yes, you want to cross. Everyone wants something from old Walder. Well, what do I get in return?" Robb spoke, his tone firm but measured. "Safe passage across your bridge. In exchange, we will ensure your lands are protected from Lannister retribution. And my mother has some proposals." At that, Catelyn stepped in. Quietly, she began laying out the terms, including certain marriages that might bind the Freys closer to House Tully or House Stark. She even hinted that the Tyrells might be open to beneficial unions with lesser Freys, though she did not promise anything specific. Margaery watched closely, stepping in only when she sensed Walder Frey's roving gaze lingered on her. She dropped gentle hints about how the Tyrells valued loyal allies, how they might welcome new wards or fosterlings at Highgarden. All of it was a delicate dance, for no one truly desired to marry a Frey unless it was necessary. Eventually, Walder Frey held up a bony hand. "Enough. I know I have the power here. You want quick crossing, you'll give me something of real value." Robb shifted, tension flickering across his face. "Name your price, and we shall see if it's possible." The old man's thin lips curled. "First, I want your assurance that when you are done with your war, you won't forget the phrase. I want a marriage alliance. If not with the heir to Winterfell, you've already wed him off, then maybe one of your siblings. How many does old Ned Stark have?" Catelyn's nostrils flared. "My daughters are my own concern." Walder Frey wagged a finger. Now, one might be for Joffrey, but you have another, yes? Arya, I recall. She's not betrothed, is she?" Robb's expression darkened. Arya was far too young and wild besides. The idea of giving her to a Frey turned his stomach. But he glanced at his mother, who carefully kept her face neutral. "We can discuss that in time," Catelyn said. "Arya is still a child." Walder Frey shrugged. "A child becomes a woman soon enough. I want a betrothal if you expect me to risk Lannister wrath. That, and my pride demands another gesture of goodwill." He turned his attention to Margaery, and she felt a prickling at the back of her neck. "Or perhaps a foster arrangement with the Tyrells. I have grandchildren who could learn courtly graces." Margaery stayed calm. "We can consider fostering. My father might welcome a young Frey or two at Highgarden, if terms are suitable." He cackled. "Suitable indeed. You try to keep it vague, southern girl, but I'll hold you to it. And I'll want coin if the fostering is to happen. Don't think I don't know how these things work." Catelyn interjected, Her voice pointed. You'll have your betrothal or fostering, but only once you open your gates to our entire host. We cross swiftly and peacefully, no interference from your men. Walder Frey smacked his lips. Deal. But you'd best keep your word. Or I'll keep you locked out. Or in if you set foot again. Thus, the arrangement was set. They shared salt and bread, sealing the bargain in that precarious custom that Walder Frey seemed to delight in twisting. But at least, by the next morning, the twins' gates stood open. The northern host filed across the great stone bridge, foot soldiers, cavalry, supply wagons. The crossing took half a day, with Walder Frey's brood watching from battlements, their expressions smug. Marjorie rode beside Robb at the head of the column, ignoring the chill that curled in her stomach at the memory of Walder Frey's grasping demands. She told herself it was a necessary evil. If they could save Ned Stark, free the Riverlands, and stand against the Lannisters, it would be worth it. Once on the far side, they reorganized. Scouts were sent ahead to gauge Jaime Lannister's positions around Riverrun. A tense energy rippled through the ranks. The men knew battle might be near. They marched west now, aiming for Edmure Tully's seat. Along the way, they encountered scattered pockets of Lannister outriders. Skirmishes broke out. Robb insisted that Marjorie remain with Catelyn near the rear of the army during these engagements. Reluctantly, she obeyed, watching from afar as northern cavalry swept the fields, clashing with gold-cloaked riders who swiftly retreated rather than face the brunt of the northern force. For the first time, Marjorie truly witnessed the blood and horror of open conflict. Men lay groaning in the tall grass, some in the final throes of death. Horses screamed with mortal wounds. Though she had seen injuries before, sparring accidents, or the occasional serious mishap, this was different. Smoke from burning farmland drifted across the fields, stinging her eyes. She forced herself to ride forward with the healers after each skirmish, distributing water, helping with bandages, offering words of comfort to those too far gone to save. Catelyn aided her, though the lady's face was drawn and pale. It was heartbreakingly clear that neither had been prepared to see men butchered in such numbers. When they returned to camp that night, Marjorie struggled to keep a firm mask of composure. Robb found her near her tent, cleaning blood from her hands with a bucket of cold water. She looked up at him, her eyes glistening. Is this what war always looks like? She asked, voice trembling. The stories speak of glory and heroism, but this is... He knelt beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. There is no real glory, he said quietly. It's men killing men, and good folk suffer. I'm sorry. She closed her eyes, letting her tears slip free. I hate it. Robb's voice was soft. So do I. But if we do nothing, the Lannisters burn and plunder unopposed. They already hold my father captive. We can't let them run rampant. I know, she whispered. I just needed to say it out loud. He pulled her into his arms and she let her head rest against his shoulder, allowing herself a moment of vulnerability. He stroked her hair gently, murmuring the sorts of soft reassurances that had no real power against the brutality of war, yet helped ease the immediate sting of heartbreak. The next morning, they pressed on. The scouts reported that Jaime Lannister's lines encircled Riverrun, but not as tightly as he might have wished. The Tully garrison harried him with raids, and Edmure Tully maintained control of the castle itself. More importantly, Jaime had not yet learned the full strength of Robb's army. He likely expected resistance, but not an alliance bolstered by Tyrell authority in the background. Our advantage is surprise, Robb told his captains. We'll split our forces, half under Bolton, half under me. We'll feint from the north, forcing Jaime to respond, then strike from the west once he's engaged. If we can break his lines, the Tullys can sally forth from Riverrun and trap him. Marjorie stood by, listening. She occasionally asked small clarifying questions. How would the Tully horns signal their attack? How would messages be relayed in the chaos to ensure that everyone understood the plan? The lords, impressed by her interest, explained patiently. Catelyn announced that she would remain with the supply train out of direct harm. Marjorie intended to stay there as well, fulfilling her role as best she could, though she knew, in her heart, that she wanted to be near Robb. He needed her. Yet he also needed to lead men without fearing for her safety every moment. Before they departed, Marjorie and Robb stood at the bank of a little creek. The early morning light turned the water to liquid copper. He reached for her hand, his own trembling slightly with the knowledge that this could be the day he led men into the largest battle of his life. I will see you after this is done, he said. She lifted his hand and pressed a kiss to his knuckles. Be careful. Jaime Lannister is no fool. He is called the Kingslayer for a reason. Robb's lips curved into a grim line. I know. But if we succeed, we'll free Riverrun. That'll put real pressure on the Lannisters and King's Landing. Perhaps it will force them to negotiate for my father's release. She nodded. The Tyrells are on their way too. If we can hold out it. He nodded back. Then we show the realm that the wolf and the rose stand against the lion. Perhaps others will follow. A moment later, he kissed her swiftly, then mounted his horse. Grey Wind padded beside him, hackles slightly raised in anticipation of the coming fight. He raised a hand in farewell, then spurred his mount to join the line of cavalry heading off under the Stark banner. Marjorie watched him go, a knot tightening in her gut. She joined Catelyn and Lady Olenna at a safe vantage on a low rise. They had a handful of guards plus a scattering of tents for the healers. From here, they could see in the distance the wide meadows around Riverrun, the flash of sunlight on steel, the glint of the river waters. The castle's banners, silver trout on a red and blue field, fluttered from the battlements. As the morning wore on, the low thunder of hooves echoed across the plain. From the vantage, Marjorie glimpsed lines of men forming, a swirl of banners snapping in the breeze, Karstark and Glover, Umber and Bolton. On the Lannisters' side, crimson and gold flickered like tongues of flame. Far to the west, she thought she spied another cluster of forces moving, likely Robb's flank, circling to strike. Catelyn stood with rigid posture, her eyes never leaving the field. Occasionally, she muttered a fervent prayer to the Seven or the old gods, anything that might shield her son. Olenna, though outwardly calm, kept tapping her cane on the ground in restless agitation. Marjorie's nails bit into her palms as the tensions mounted. She heard horns blast across the distance, one, two, then a third, with an answering horn from Riverrun's walls. Within moments, the clash began. Even from afar, they could hear the roar of men, the crash of steel, the high whinnies of horses. Dust and churned earth rose in a haze. It was impossible to make out individual fighters or movements. The mass of men surged like tidal waves colliding. Faintly, Marjorie saw a surge from the castle gates, likely a sally by the Tully defenders. Arrows arced overhead. Shouts and screams merged into a din that made her heart pound. Time distorted. She wasn't sure if it was minutes or hours. She found herself clutching Catelyn's hand, or perhaps Catelyn was clutching hers. They watched as men fell. Banners wavered and fell. At times, the Lannister lines seemed to hold strong. Then, from the west, a fresh wave of cavalry thundered in a Robb's force, presumably. Suddenly, a horn sounded in rapid bursts. The Lannisters' lines quivered, parted, and began to buckle. Another volley of arrows from the Tully ramparts struck. Then came the ringing cry that carried even to their vantage. Stark! Stark! Marjorie's heart soared. They were forcing Jaime's men back. Another flurry of horns, and then she saw the Lannister banners receding, scattering. Some men threw down their arms while others formed desperate knots of resistance. The conflict was still raging, but the tide had turned. Riverrun's gates swung wide and Tully riders poured forth. By midday, the din began to fade, replaced by sporadic shouts and the moans of the wounded. Northern soldiers moved through the field, securing prisoners, rounding up Lannister stragglers. The main red and gold banner had fallen. Riverrun's drawbridge lowered fully, and Edmure Tully himself, recognizable by the bright Tully surcoat, rode out, greeting the victors. The watchers on the hill exhaled in relief. Catelyn looked ready to crumble with gratitude. Marjorie pressed a hand to her racing heart. Lady Olenna gave a curt nod, as if to say, "Well done. But it's only the beginning." Before long, word reached them. Robb Stark had led the western flank that shattered Jaime's lines. The Kingslayer himself had retreated, but rumor had it he was forced to flee into the nearby forests with only a handful of guards. Many Lannister knights lay dead or captured. Riverrun was free. Catelyn insisted on riding down to the battlefield at once. Marjorie joined her, ignoring the gore underfoot. Bodies, both friend and foe, dotted the ground. Healers moved among the wounded, triaging them in hasty camps. They found Robb near a shallow ditch where a cluster of Lannister men had made a final stand. He was dismounting, Grey Wind prowling at his side, muzzle stained red. Robb himself looked unhurt but spattered with mud and blood. When he saw his mother and Marjorie approach, he exhaled a breath of relief. "You're safe," he said, voice raw. Catelyn slid down from her horse and flung her arms around him. He embraced her in return, murmuring an apology for having to fight this war at all. Marjorie stood close by, her eyes scanning him anxiously. A shallow gash cut across his left forearm, but otherwise he seemed whole. She laid a hand gently on his arm. "You're bleeding." He looked down as though noticing the wound for the first time. "It's nothing." A Lannister spear caught me in passing. I barely felt it. We'll have the healers see to it, she insisted, her voice quivering with a mix of relief and concern. Edmure Tully rode up then, dismounting with a pained grimace. He had a bandaged cut on his brow. "Robb Stark," he said breathlessly, "you have my gratitude. Riverrun stands free because of you." Robb inclined his head. "We couldn't leave you besieged, my lord. I only wish we could have captured Jaime Lannister." Edmure's lips tightened. "He fled, but not with his full strength. Much of his force is scattered or killed. If we move swiftly, we might hunt him down, though I fear some of his men still roam." Marjorie looked around at the carnage. "For the moment, let us see to the wounded on both sides. Once the living are tended, then we can decide how to pursue Jaime." The men agreed, and soon the Northern Army took control of the battlefield. Prisoners were herded to one side, wounded to another. Edmure invited Robb, Catelyn, and their key commanders into Riverrun for a proper council and rest. Marjorie joined Robb, riding through the castle gates amid cheering Tully soldiers and small folk. She glimpsed banners with the trout, ramparts where archers stood, doorways where frightened families peered out. Many seemed astonished to see the rumored Stark-Tyrell alliance in the flesh. Inside the keep, they were greeted by a tearful staff offering bread and salt. Marjorie assisted where she could, offering quiet thanks. Robb was ushered to the great hall, where chairs had been arranged for the war council. Servants brought hot water for cleaning wounds and fresh garments. Marjorie personally helped Robb peel off his bloodied surcoat and insisted that a maester examine his arm. When at last he was somewhat cleaned and bandaged, he sank into a chair with a weary sigh. Catelyn approached, her expression caught between pride and sorrow. "Your father would be proud," she said. "You've won a significant victory." Robb's blue-gray eyes flickered. "I only wish it would bring father home faster." Edmure Tully, seated nearby, spoke up. "We have Lannister prisoners, including some lesser knights who might be of value. They might be ransomed, or perhaps exchanged for Lord Stark, if Joffrey or Cersei see sense." Catelyn's gaze turned hopeful. "Yes, if we can contact King's Landing quickly enough. Though I fear how much control the Queen has over Joffrey's decisions. The boy is easily swayed by his own cruelty." Marjorie folded her hands in her lap. "We must show them that continuing this war will only end in ruin for them. And that's where my father's army comes in. If the Lannisters realize they face not just the North but also the Reach, they might see negotiation as their only option." They spoke late into the night, deciding how best to fortify Riverrun and search for Jaime Lannister's remnants. Already, riders were scouring the countryside. The plan emerged that Robb would remain near Riverrun to secure the region and rally more riverlords to his cause. Meanwhile, a contingent would hurry south to meet Mace Tyrell's host, if needed, ensuring the Lannisters did not regroup at Harrenhal. Around midnight they adjourned. Robb, nearly staggering with exhaustion, escorted Marjorie to the chamber prepared for them. It was a modest room with thick stone walls and a small fireplace. He sank onto the edge of the bed, face drawn. She closed the door behind them, crossing the room to him. "How do you feel?" she asked gently. He stared at his hands, which still bore faint smears of blood in the creases. "I feel relieved to have one, but hollow for those who died." She lowered herself beside him. "That's war. We can only hope it leads to peace sooner." He turned to her, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "I saw you on the field afterwards with the healers. You're braver than I realized." Marjorie managed a wry smile. "Bravery, perhaps. Or maybe I just couldn't stand by while people lay dying. You said it yourself. My father raised me to grow strong, but my grandmother always reminded me that we can't leave the powerless to suffer alone." He let out a long exhale. Then his arm encircled her waist, pulling her into a gentle embrace. She rested her head on his shoulder, lulled by the slow rhythm of his breathing. For a moment the world outside, its warring houses and clashing armies, seemed distant. They were just two young people thrust into a terrible game, clinging to each other for solace. A soft knock on the door roused them. Marjorie stood, smoothing her rumpled skirts, and opened it a crack. A Tully servant stood there, apologizing for the interruption. "My lady, we have an urgent raven for Lord Stark. From King's Landing." Her heart lurched. She beckoned the servant to enter. The man handed a sealed scroll to Robb, who rose at once, ripping off the Lannister red wax. His eyes darted over the parchment. Slowly, his expression hardened into a grim mask. Marjorie couldn't breathe for a moment. "What does it say?" Robb swallowed. "It's from the Queen Regent Cersei Lannister. She congratulates us on our victory and states that if we do not stand down at once, my father's life is forfeit." A chill ran through Marjorie. "They threaten to kill him?" He nodded, voice tight. "Yes. She demands that I swear fealty to King Joffrey, disband my forces, and return to Winterfell under penalty of Ned Stark's execution. There's no mention of Sansa. Nothing about an exchange for the prisoners we hold." A wave of rage and fear flushed through him. The scroll crackled in his grip. "They want me to yield. They think I'll bend the knee to save my father. Gods help me. I would do anything to save him, but—" Tears brimmed in Catelyn's eyes when she learned of the message, and anger contorted Edmure's features. The Northern Lords gathered, each outraged that the Lannisters tried to ransom Ned Stark's life for submission. "They're panicking," Great John Umber growled. "They know we hold Riverrun now. They're trying to force us to yield." Bolton's quiet voice slithered in. "Perhaps it's a bluff. Even Cersei must know that if she kills Lord Stark, the North will never surrender. They'd have no hostages left to threaten us." Catelyn turned stricken eyes to her son. "Robb, if they mean to kill your father, we cannot lose him." He bowed his head. "No, we can't. But if we yield, they'll only have us all in chains. They might kill father anyway once we're disarmed. It's a trap." Marjorie's throat felt tight. She reached for Robb's hand. "Then we don't yield. We press forward. We show them we're not afraid. And if the Tyrells come in force, we might reach King's Landing before they do anything rash." The table erupted with opinions. Some demanded immediate march to King's Landing. Others argued for caution. Catelyn's face was drawn, as though every breath hurt. Marjorie placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, but Catelyn could only stare at the parchment that threatened Ned Stark's life. Hours of debate led to a decision. They would not yield. They would march south, gathering every ally they could, to bring the war to the Lannisters' doorstep. Letters went out to King's Landing, offering a prisoner exchange for Ned's release. If the Queen refused, they would show no mercy. A day later, as they organized troops to head farther south, a rider arrived from the Tyrell vanguard, bearing news that Mace Tyrell's army was crossing the Blackwater Rush. The Crownlands stood in alarm. Though many lords there nominally supported the new boy king, they were ill-prepared for a full Tyrell host. The same letter reported that Renly Baratheon had fled the capital with Loras Tyrell, though their whereabouts remained uncertain. "We can rendezvous with my father's forces near the area known as the Blackwater," Marjorie told Robb. "If he's that close to King's Landing, we might strike quickly." Robb's eyes lit with grim determination. "Yes, and if we stand outside the city walls with both the North and the Reach, Cersei will have to free my father. They can't withstand a siege from such a combined force, not without risking famine or unrest in the city." Catelyn's expression was anxious. "We must move swiftly. The Lannisters could do something rash if they think they have no other way out." Within a day, the northern host departed Riverrun once more, leaving a small garrison to support Edmure Tully. Marjorie rode at Robb's side, while Catelyn traveled in a carriage with Lady Olenna, who insisted on helping plan the next stage of their campaign. Riverlords joined them, eager to avenge Lannister raids. The combined force swelled, forming a formidable tide of steel and banners. As they moved deeper into the Riverlands toward the Crownlands, signs of war multiplied. Burned farms, terrified peasants, stragglers from skirmishes. Though Jaime Lannister remained missing, perhaps in retreat toward Harrenhal or regrouping with Tywin, there was no doubt the Lannisters knew they came. Still, no large Lannister army appeared to oppose them. It seemed the lion had withdrawn to defend the capital or gather reinforcements. One evening, with camp set up near a bend in the Blackwater Rush, Robb and Marjorie stood on a slight hill, gazing across the water. The sun was setting, painting the sky in lurid swaths of orange and crimson. Marjorie's cloak whipped in the breeze. Robb's direwolf, Grey Wind, roamed the perimeter, occasionally circling back to stand watchful by his master's side. "So close to King's Landing now," Robb said, gesturing downriver. "Oh, a few more days' march at most." Marjorie nodded. "My father must be near. I can feel it. I've heard from Loras he escaped the city with Renly, but they might be trying to raise a separate force in the Stormlands. Regardless, the Tyrell main host should be just south of here." He turned to her, searching her eyes. "If we take the city, how do we force them to yield my father without an all-out assault? The walls are strong. Even a combined host might suffer heavy losses." She exhaled. "Perhaps we can blockade them. King's Landing relies on supplies from the Reach and the Riverlands. If we cut off their food, the city will starve. The people will riot. The Lannisters can't hold power in a city that despises them." A flicker of unease crossed Robb's features. Starving small folk into surrender, it feels cruel. But so is what they've done to the Riverlands. If it spares my father's life, perhaps it must be done. She touched his cheek softly. "We do what we must, but we'll try to end it swiftly with minimal suffering. That's what sets us apart from the Lannisters." A raven arrived later that night, confirming that Mace Tyrell was indeed close, encamped near Rosby. He would meet Robb's army in 2 days. The letter carried Mace's florid seal and a brief personal note for Marjorie stating that he was proud of her bravery and anxious to see her safe and to vanquish the Lannisters. Lady Olenna made a derisive remark about her son's pomposity, but Marjorie felt a rush of relief. Reinforcements were coming. 2 days later, on a wide plain of rolling hills, the Tyrell banners came into view. Green fields parted to reveal rank upon rank of mounted knights and men-at-arms, their armor polished, their shields bearing golden roses. It was a sight reminiscent of a grand tournament, only far larger, more ominous. Trumpets sounded from both sides as the armies drew close. Robb and Marjorie rode at the head of the northern column. From the Tyrell side, Mace Tyrell advanced, flanked by a retinue of knights including Ser Loras, resplendent in shining armor. At the center stood Lady Alysanne Tyrell, Marjorie's aunt, and Lord Garland Tyrell as well. When the two groups met in the middle of the field, Marjorie urged her horse forward, mind racing with questions. Would her father truly commit to besieging King's Landing? What demands would he make in return? Mace Tyrell dismounted, arms flung wide in theatrical relief. He was a stout man, bearded, wearing a heavy surcoat embroidered with an enormous golden rose. "My daughter," he exclaimed. "By the Seven, I'm glad you're safe. We've heard tales of your courage in the north." Marjorie slipped from her saddle, bowing her head in respect, then embraced him lightly. "Father, thank you for coming." He boomed a laugh. "How could I not? The Lannisters have overstepped themselves, and the crown is tarnished under that brat Joffrey. Besides, you're part of House Stark now, and so the Tyrells honor our ties." "I'd not see your husband's father left to rot in a cell." Loras Tyrell, removing his helm, flashed Marjorie a brief smile. "Sister," he said quietly, "you're well." She nodded. "As well as can be in a war." "You?" His expression was guarded. "We lost men in the city. Renly and I left. Things are complicated." His gaze flicked to Robb Stark, who approached. Mace Tyrell offered Robb a curt but respectful bow. "My Lord Stark, I greet you not only as my daughter's husband, but as a fellow commander. Let us rid the realm of these Lannister vipers." Robb bowed in turn. "Lord Tyrell, welcome. Your arrival may tip the balance." Mace Tyrell clapped a hand on Robb's shoulder, a gesture that was almost fatherly, though Mace seemed more boisterous than truly affectionate. "Now to business. We march on King's Landing, do we? Or do we attempt to lure out Tywin Lannister?" Robb glanced at Marjorie, then answered. "Tywin hasn't shown himself in force. He's either holed up in Harrenhal or gone to the city. We suspect the latter. If the Lannisters gather behind the walls, we'll have to besiege them or blockade them. They hold Lord Eddard Stark, and we can't let that go unchallenged." Mace Tyrell let out a dramatic sigh. "A siege of King's Landing. This will be no small feat. The city is vast, the walls are high, and they have the Red Keep. But we have numbers, and the small folk might not defend the Lannisters if they're starving. We do want to avoid harming the small folk more than necessary, Marjorie said. But yes, we must present a united front. If you and Robb Stark together surround the city, north and south, Cersei will have little choice but to negotiate. As soon as possible, Robb added firmly. We can't risk them killing my father in desperation. Mace Tyrell nodded, his expression grave for once. Then we'll waste no time. Our combined host is massive, and I doubt the city guard can stand against it, even with the Kingsguard. We march by dawn. The next day, the Allied army advanced along the King's Road. The sheer scale of their forces was breathtaking. Tens of thousands from the Reach, joined by thousands from the north and Riverlands, forming a serpentine column that stretched beyond sight. War horses pounded the road, wagons rumbled, footmen marched in dusty ranks. Pennants of Wolf and Rose streamed side by side. Catelyn Stark and Lady Olenna traveled in comfort, exchanging sharp remarks and planning how best to handle negotiations once the city was reached. Marjorie rode again with Robb, who still wore the bandage on his arm from the Riverrun battle. She noticed how the Tyrell Knights eyed him with a mix of curiosity and respect. This young wolf who had defeated the Kingslayer and freed Riverrun. They passed through small hamlets where frightened peasants cowered or fled, having heard rumors of a great host descending on the capital. Along the way, they encountered a stream of refugees moving in the opposite direction. Folk trying to escape the city, carrying meager belongings. Some cried warnings that the city was in turmoil, that King Joffrey had raised taxes, that Goldcloaks patrolled the streets with harsh discipline. Marjorie felt her dread mounting. If the city was in chaos, how might that affect Ned Stark's safety? At last, on a sweltering afternoon, they crested a rise that gave them a clear view of King's Landing in the distance. The city sprawled along the Blackwater Bay, its walls bristling with towers, the Red Keep perched on a rocky promontory. Beyond, the glitter of the sea stretched out, dotted with ships at anchor or heading out to open water. The Allied army halted to make camp, well out of arrow range. Scouts rode forward to assess the city's defenses. Robb, Marjorie, Mace Tyrell, and the High Lords gathered on that hill, gazing at the imposing sight. King's Landing had repelled many assaults in centuries past, but never had two such great houses, Stark and Tyrell, united outside its gates. The Goldcloaks man the walls, a scout reported upon returning. They've strung catapults along the battlements, and archers watch every approach. Red banners with the crowned stag and lion wave from the towers. But the people we spoke to say supplies are running thin. There's talk that the Queen has seized stores to feed the royal household, leaving many hungry. Good, Mace Tyrell grunted. That means they'll break faster. But we must be cautious. They could have wildfire stockpiled, or some other trick. Robb's expression was grim. We offer them terms. Surrender Lord Eddard Stark, relinquish the city, and we spare them from destruction. If they refuse, we cut off their supply routes and starve them into submission. And if that still doesn't move them? Asked Lord Randall Tarley, who stood at Mace Tyrell's side. Are we prepared to storm the walls? A hush fell. Marjorie shuddered at the thought of a full-scale assault. Thousands would die. The Red Keep's formidable fortifications could cause massive losses among the attackers. Meanwhile, Ned Stark was within those walls. If the Lannisters felt cornered, they might execute him out of spite. Finally, Lady Olenna, who had arrived in a covered litter, shuffled forward. We'll present them with the choice. But first, we must show them how hopeless resistance is. Surround the city from the landward side, blockade the Blackwater Bay with any ships that support us, and let them stare out at an army they cannot defeat. Then we will see how bold the Lannisters truly are. All agreed to the plan. They established a ring of encampments, carefully positioned to guard against any sally or trick from the city's defenders. Mace Tyrell began negotiations with the captains of a few ships from the Reach, who might blockade the harbor. Over the next few days, messengers rode under flags of truce to the city gates, carrying demands. Release Lord Eddard Stark and yield the city to the combined forces of House Stark and House Tyrell, or face ruin. The Lannisters' replies were evasive, claiming that Ned Stark was held for treason and would be tried, that King Joffrey would not yield to rebels. A standstill ensued. Every morning, Marjorie gazed at the city's high walls, dreading the possibility that Cersei might do something drastic. One afternoon, a surprise came. A lone rider bearing the sigil of the Kingsguard approached under a white flag. The camp guards escorted him in. Robb, Marjorie, and Catelyn awaited him in a pavilion hung with Stark and Tyrell banners. The rider removed his helm, revealing himself as Ser Meryn Trant, dour-faced, eyes flicking about with poorly disguised disdain. He offered a parchment, a royal proclamation from King Joffrey Baratheon to the traitors encamped outside his walls. Robb snatched the parchment and read it. His expression grew stormy. He demands our immediate surrender. He says that Ned Stark will confess his crimes in the Baelor September tomorrow, and if we do not lay down our arms, Joffrey will have him beheaded. Catelyn let out a gasp, her face going white. Marjorie felt as though ice water had been poured down her spine. Ser Meryn sneered. His grace is merciful. Lord Stark need only confess and swear fealty. Then you might all be spared. Robb's voice trembled with fury. If he harms my father, there will be no mercy for the Lannisters or anyone who stands with them. Ser Meryn shrugged. Deliver your answer soon. The execution is scheduled for tomorrow at midday. He turned and left under guard, leaving the pavilion in stunned silence. Catelyn clutched Robb's arm. We must do something. They'll kill him tomorrow. Marjorie swallowed hard. We need a plan. If they truly intend to bring him to the Great September, that means he'll be out in public. Is there a way to intervene, to rescue him before Joffrey can act? Silence. Then Robb's eyes lit with desperate hope. If we can get men into the city somehow, there are tunnels, or we might bribe the gold cloaks. My father has friends there, possibly the city watch might turn. Marjorie thought quickly. What if the Tyrell name still carries weight? My father had influence at court when King Robert was alive. Loras might be able to slip inside. He knows the Red Keep's layout somewhat. Any infiltration is risky, Catelyn said. But if the alternative is letting Ned die, we must try. And quickly. That night, a hurried council convened. A bold plan emerged. Fueled by desperation, they would attempt a small infiltration at dawn, disguised among wagons delivering supplies or hidden in the retinue of a bribed Goldglow captain. Loras Tyrell volunteered to lead the group along with men who were adept at stealth. Robb wanted to go, but the lords insisted the commander of the host must not risk capture or death. Marjorie, too, was told to remain behind. The plan was simple but perilous. If Ned Stark truly appeared in the Great September of Baelor at midday, Loras and his men would create a diversion, snatch him, and flee to a waiting postern gate. Simultaneously, a show of force from outside the walls would distract the gold cloaks on the ramparts. It was a gamble that could easily collapse if Joffrey had archers ring the September, or if the city populace turned hostile. As dawn broke, Marjorie stood with Robb at the edge of the encampment, watching Loras Tyrell and a handful of picked men vanish into the early morning mist toward a gate rumored to be guardable by a bribed watch officer. A hush lay over the camp, the tension so thick it weighed on every breath. No one knew if it would work. No one knew if Joffrey might simply decide to kill Ned Stark the moment he saw him. Marjorie chewed her lip until she tasted blood, fear gnawing at her. Robb paced like a caged wolf, gray wind mirroring his agitation. Catelyn and Lady Olenna prayed quietly, each in their own way. Midday approached. From outside the walls, they could see the massive dome of the Great September of Baelor rising above the city. Bells began to toll, echoing across the rooftops and drifting over the plains where the army stood. Crowds gathered in the streets, tiny dark shapes from this distance. The watchers from the allied host could do little but wait, as the plan relied on stealth. Then the sudden clamor of horns erupted from the city walls. Shouts rang out. Fires appeared in pockets near the gates. Was that the start of Loras's diversion? Or an unrelated riot? No one could tell. Robb immediately ordered a show of force, archers to the front, cavalry poised, siege weapons readied, but held back from launching a full assault, lest it prompt Ned's immediate execution. Moments stretched like hours. The bells of the September tolled again, and the city seemed to convulse with some new commotion. Hazy figures ran along the parapets. Smoke curled from somewhere near the dragon pit. Then, with a sharp crack, part of a tower's facade collapsed, perhaps a result of sabotage or stray catapult fire. Robb cursed under his breath. What is happening in there? Marjorie's pulse thundered. She squeezed Robb's hand. They must have done something big. We have to trust your father has a chance to slip away in the chaos. Minutes later, a watchman on a high vantage shouted that a band of horsemen were racing out of the city gate at breakneck speed, possibly Goldcloaks in pursuit of someone. Robb urged his horse forward, scanning for a sign. Then, through the haze, they saw a small group of riders emerge from a lesser postern gate near the muddy banks of the Blackwater. At their head, armor flashing in the sunlight, galloped Loras Tyrell. Behind him, slumped across a horse, was a figure in tattered clothing, hair a shock of gray. "Ned!" Catelyn cried. Robb spurred his horse, Marjorie following. Guards rushed to meet them. The riders pounded across open ground, pursued by a ragged handful of Goldcloaks who soon faltered as they came into range of the northern archers. Arrows whistled and the Goldcloaks reeled back or fell. Loras Tyrell reached the allied lines, breath heaving, blood spattered across his breastplate. Ned Stark clung to the saddle, barely conscious, face pale, a bandage around his shoulder. Immediately, Robb helped his father down, cradling him while Catelyn wept with relief. Marjorie pressed in, seeing the gauntness in Ned's features. He looked like he hadn't eaten properly in days. "Father," Robb murmured. "You're safe now." Ned's eyes flickered open. He winced in pain. "Robb, Catelyn, gods, you shouldn't have come here. The city, Joffrey." "Hush," Catelyn said, tears streaming. "We have you now. It's over." Loras dismounted, staggering. "We created a diversion. Joffrey had him on the steps, forced him to confess. Then at the last moment, we attacked. The Goldcloaks tried to block us, but some of their officers were bribed. We barely escaped." Marjorie slipped an arm around Loras, supporting him. "You did it. You saved him." He gave a grim nod. "Barely. Joffrey gave the order for Island Pain to strike. We had to fight on the September steps. Swords clashed all around. The crowd panicked. I thought we wouldn't make it out alive." Ned Stark coughed, wincing again at some hidden injury. Robb and Catelyn exchanged worried looks. "We have maesters," Robb said. "We'll take him to the healers. Then we decide our next step." Word of Ned Stark's rescue spread through the Allied camp like wildfire. Cheers erupted, though they were tinged with the knowledge that they stood on the brink of a full-scale assault. Cersei and Joffrey would not let this insult go unanswered. But for now, father and son were reunited. Marjorie and Robb walked beside Ned's litter as it carried him to a large medical tent. His injuries were numerous: broken ribs, bruises, a shoulder wound that festered. But a maester assured them that, with rest and proper care, he might recover. Outside, the war raged on a political front. Joffrey had lost his prized hostage. The allied lords debated whether to storm the city in the next day or two, hoping to dethrone the Lannisters for good. That evening, Marjorie found Robb sitting at Ned's bedside, watching over him. She slipped into the tent, quietly lowering herself onto a stool. Ned Stark slept, face slack with exhaustion, but his breathing was more stable. A single lantern cast flickering shadows across the canvas walls. Robb glanced up. "He's resting," he whispered. "The maester says it's a miracle he survived that fight in the September." "He's strong," Marjorie replied softly. "Like you." A faint, grateful smile touched Robb's lips. His hand reached out and she wove her fingers through his. They sat in silence, listening to the rasp of Ned's breathing. Beyond the tent flap, the hustle of the camp continued. Men calling orders, horses whinnying, the distant crackle of cooking fires. After a time, Marjorie murmured, "What now? Do we press the attack and try to take the city?" Robb exhaled slowly. "The Lannisters will be in disarray, but they're dangerous. Some lords say we should dethrone Joffrey immediately and place Stannis or Renly on the throne. Others want to name me king in the north and secede. My father, he was always loyal to the rightful king. But the rightful king is gone, and the boy on the throne is a monster." She squeezed his hand. "You don't have to decide this moment. Your father's alive. Talk to him when he's able to speak." "I will," Robb said. "One thing's certain. The North and the Reach have shown we won't bend to the Lannisters. War might continue, or maybe they'll negotiate. But whatever comes, we face it together." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Together, the wolf and the rose." A gentle hush fell. Ned stirred once in his sleep, muttering something unintelligible, and Robb soothed him by placing a hand on his father's uninjured arm. Marjorie closed her eyes, exhaustion tugging at her, but a thread of hope glowing in her heart. They had saved Ned Stark. Whatever storms yet loomed over the realm, whatever future battles or intrigues threatened, they had accomplished that crucial victory. And so, on that night, Amid the flickering lamplight and the subdued hum of an army poised outside the greatest city in Westeros, Marjorie Tyrell Stark allowed herself to believe that perhaps honor, love, and unity might yet steer the realm away from total ruin. The future was unwritten, the war still raging, but at least for now, a father had been saved, and two great houses stood as one, forging a new chapter in the story of the Seven Kingdoms. One shaped not by the triumphant roar of a single lion, but by the resolute howl of the wolf and the steadfast bloom of the rose.